So Jenni, Pittman, and I are going to be talking about the 2023 Spring Flood After Action Review, a review of what happened. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jenni to go through the beginning of the presentation.
Thanks, Alli. So I would be remiss not to mention our two adjudicators, and we'll acknowledge them again at the end, but Ryan Nutzveg and Scott Doomer were our two adjudicators for this regional after action review. If you've not been through one of those processes before, we have all of the local offices that were impacted by a large scale event or an event that we need to learn something from. And then we have two adjudicators, one from more of the WCM or ISD side and one from more of the SUE or STI side, that will put all of those local AARs together and create a regional AAR with best practices, what could be improved, and then any action items that come out of it. So this is an example of one such AAR, and I know a lot of you were impacted by this or have been through this process, but we just kind of want to share what we learned from this and what we can apply moving forward. So here's just the general outline for what we'll talk about today. I'll give a quick event overview, kind of how things set up meteorologically, and then overview also what went well in this case, which was quite a few things. And then Alli will finish us up with what could be improved and any action items that came out of this AAR. So I'll start here with the event overview. This winter, so this was the previous winter, 2023 into 2024, started out with an abnormally dry to moderate drought leading into winter. So pretty dry, not a lot of snowfall leading into kind of the early spring. But then we did have several heavy snows across the upper Midwest, which resulted in an abnormally deep snowpack by late winter. So pretty dry start, but then we did have quite a bit of heavy snow that led us into the spring. The initial spring snowmelt flooding outlooks acknowledged that abnormal snowpack, but also acknowledged the drought conditions. And so this initial very first snowmelt flooding outlook indicated that there would be an average flood risk. Fortunately, we have several of those. So as continued snowfall happened through February, our concerns were heightened for snowmelt flooding. And then we did really have well below temperatures through early April, which continued to maintain that snowpack through early April. Once we got to mid-April, there was a rapid warm-up, and some locations actually lost up to 20 inches of snow depth just in that first half of April. As expected with the drought, some of that was absorbed into the ground, but since there was so much lingering snowpack and those additional snowfalls during the late winter, a lot of it was also routed into the area waterways. And I believe I have an animated GIF on the next slide that shows just how rapid that snowmelt was. This is a one-day interval, so each frame here is just one day, and this is the period from April 7th through the 13th, and you can see that pretty extensive snowpack melting just within that 1 week very rapidly. So you can see how this might lead to flooding. So snowmelt in the Red River of the North, we're all familiar with that basin and how easily it can flood and how impactful it can be. Fortunately, that snowmelt was pretty staggered and eased some of the burden on that main stem. So the Red River main stem reached minor flood by mid-April and did see some moderate flooding with some isolated major flooding into the first week of May. But further to the east, across northeastern Minnesota and northwest Wisconsin, we did have a much more rapid snowmelt, as you saw in the previous animated GIF. And that was also compounded by some rainfall that occurred in April as well. So they did have much more widespread flooding, reaching major flooding on all, minor to major flooding on all major river basins during the spring. So our adjudicators were able to put this together for us, just kind of a timeline that shows the process through the spring. So in January is when the partner outreach started for that snowmelt flood potential. And the first routine spring flood and water resources outlook was issued in early February, the 9th and the 10th. And that's the one that called for that average flood risk. But again, we had additional snowfall after that. So the spring flood outlook that was issued February 23rd and 24th called for that above normal flood risk and the potential for moderate to major flooding. The third routine flood and water resources outlook called for moderate to major flooding, again highlighting that snowmelt issue that was going to occur. And then there was actually an unscheduled fourth outlook just listed as an update. And that continued that messaging for that high probability of significant spring flooding. So this is a non-routine outlook that was really impactful and really important for partners, especially as this spring flood just lingered a little bit longer than it has in some cases. So by early to mid-April, the flooding had started. Several rivers were in flood stage by April 15th. Most of those rivers did crest by mid to late April. And generally, we call the end of the event sometime in May. Some rivers were still in flood stage by late May, but generally that's when we indicate that this event was starting to wrap up. So there were several things that went well, and you'll notice that these findings are not in numerical order, and that's because I tried to group them into categories. So first, let's talk about what went well with IDSS. So one of our findings was that the potential for significant snowmelt flooding was well recognized and well communicated by the RFC and the WFOs that were impacted. And there were lots of examples, but some of those examples include partner webinars that were in addition to those Spring Flood Outlook webinars. And then also city, county, and state decision makers were able to use all of this information. It was actionable, and they were able to use it in that mitigation stage. Another finding was that daily emails, webinars, conference calls, meetings, and social media material were provided to partners throughout the event. So all of our offices that provided us local AARs had some really great examples of the IDSS that we're providing on a daily basis. And then the last finding here under IDSS was that the spring flood outlooks were very well received by partners, and particularly that non-standard, that fourth additional outlook that was later in March was very well received by partners. So another topic of what went well were within our data and our forecasts. So daily forecast changes were collaborated between the WFOs and the RFC very effectively. The ranges were provided for river crest stages, and then timing was also provided within the RBF notes section. So even though, and we'll talk about HEFS later, but even though that wasn't fully implemented, we were still able to have some ranges, some non-just deterministic information provided to the forecast offices. That HEFS guidance, like I mentioned, was well received by those that were able to use it, and also the hydrologic partners in the EM community. And so some of the success stories from HEFS were that service hydrologists were able to, during the flood event, work directly with their partners to assist with interpretation. And Minneapolis, I believe, in some cases actually saw a reduced number of phone calls from the public because they were able to interpret HEFS and determine their own level of risk. And then the last one here, during the event, there were snow water equivalent surveys that were conducted, and that really helped evaluate and validate those snow water equivalent estimates across some lesser populated areas where we don't always have that information, and that really improved the OWP and NCRFC snow models. We also had a lot of mutual aid going on during this. Our WFOs were very busy, as were the RFCs. So several of our findings do relate to mutual aid and our internal communications. So pre-planning for staffing and assigned forecast responsibilities led to our successful services. Some of those pre-planning examples include using hydrologic playbooks. That was an example from Grand Forks, and planning extra staffing even into the planning schedule. And that was from WFO Duluth. We did have a couple of flood-specific internal Google Chat spaces that were used for collaboration between the WFO and RFC, and those that were involved did find that to be a very successful collaboration space. And then virtual mutual aid was also used to assist the RFC operations once they identified that there were some potential workload issues. And the ROC and our Central Region hydrologists, Marin and Jess, were able to work with the WFOs to develop and implement mutual aid for NCRFC during their periods of very high workload. So I believe that's all for me, and I will turn it over to Alli to talk about some of the things that could be improved and some of our action items that are still lingering.
Yeah, so while a lot went well with this event, there were some things that we could learn from and some challenges that could be addressed going forward. So first up, in terms of bridging the gap between the last spring outlook and when the flooding started to occur, it was found that offices were challenged to assess and communicate the flood potential or risk during the time period between the last probabilistic outlook and when the snow actually began to melt. So really bridging that gap was a challenge. And so as a result, It was also found that in some instances, HEFs being used by WFOs helped to fill the gap for that. So as a result, some of the action items going forward are for the NCRFC and MBRFC to evaluate how they can further leverage HEFs to provide better long-term probabilistic services. And then they'll share their findings with Central Region. And then for this fiscal year, all operational Central Region personnel are going to be completing the How to Interpret Hydrologic Ensemble Forecast Service, or HEFS, or HEFS, short-term guidance. And that's expected by the end of March. And then in addition, hydro program managers will also complete what is the Hydrologic Ensemble Forecast Service. So boosting up our training so we can be better prepared going into the season to leverage HEFs. Another area that could be improved upon is with our key messages. So a spring flood key messages document was created by the Central Region ROC to ensure that all Central Region offices had a reliable resource of clear and consistent messages that could be quickly utilized when fielding questions from the public or partners. So it was found that there was a little bit of confusion with regards to the purpose of the key messages document. So having a standard operating procedure established prior to spinning up this document would have reduced some of that confusion. And so it was also found that the cost benefit of updating the document was a bit unclear. So going forward, the ROC and the hydro program leaders are going to refine the collaborated spring flooding key messages document that was created and further build out the SOP for the next season, and then implement those results region-wide. So while collaboration, a lot of it did go well, there was a lot of platforms that were used, but sometimes they didn't include all the people or offices that should have benefited from being in those collaboration platforms. So there's a challenge with that. And then also going back to mutual aid, while mutual aid was found to be helpful for the offices that leveraged it, mutual aid, but the opportunity for it was received varied responses from staff at local offices and led to inconsistent application across the region. And part of this, I think, was the lack of familiarity of mutual aid and the mutual aid request process. So going forward, the Central Region ROC is going to determine a process to provide mutual aid information to offices at certain operations or service levels. I know this is something that they've already been working on and have a process more or less already. So we've already seen some improvement there. So hopefully we'll see an improvement with mutual aid with the next spring flooding event. It was also found that post-event data collection was often challenging and not robust. Challenges with this was that there was limited WFO staff to conduct the surveys and collect information and obtain feedback from core partners. So when they were able to obtain feedback, it was helpful, but just the sheer amount of resources led to a challenge. And that it was found that using a post-flood checklist to detail the kind of post-event activities would help for future events. So going forward, Central Region Services and Science are going to convene a working group to develop and implement a post-flood operations and recovery checklist based on the work that's being done by the Southeast Subregional Hydro Group. Then just a few other challenges, kind of the actual ground truth observations. So comparing the historic crest impacts to the impacts that actually occurred was found that the historic crest impacts may not have always been representative, and the impact statements were found to not always be accurate. So the updates to impact statements were a challenge prior to and after this and other flood events. And it was found that WFO staff often had limited responses from partners for specific information to make impact statement updates. And then also just the modeling of the dry soil conditions was a challenge. And it may not have been accurately incorporated into the river forecasting model because it was found that the RFC river forecasts were higher than observed for many of the rivers across the upper Midwest. And then some additional action items when it comes to products and services. Central Region Science and Services is going to work to develop some additional resources for external partner engagement. So materials that can be shared with others outside of our agency. And that'll include information related to HEFs and flood outlooks. And then also Central Region is going to work to develop a method to coordinate between the offices, so the RFCs, the WFOs, and Central Region Hydro to determine if additional spring outlooks should be released outside of the initial outlook issuance schedule. So overall, some takeaways from this event. While event-based chat rooms were used to share information, and there's some great collaboration, it was found that it was a challenge to include all the people or offices that would have benefit from the communication and awareness. We learned some lessons related to updating the Central Region Collaborated Spring Flood Key Messages document, and that'll be applied going forward for future flooding events. HEFs was found useful and received by partners, well received by partners. But the understanding of HEFs will increase in Central Region with further training and evaluation. And then the opportunity for mutual aid, while it received varied responses from staff at different offices, overall the offices that did leverage mutual aid found it to be very helpful. So again, want to thank our adjudicators, Scott Dumer at MBRFC and Brian Knutsvig at Lincoln. And then thank you to all the offices that provided the local AARs to make this regional after action review possible. And thank you all for listening. So I know we're past time, but if there are any questions, Jenni and I can stay on for a few minutes. And I know we do have our other hydro SMEs that presented on FIM earlier still available. So we'll stick on. If there's any questions, feel free to raise your hand or enter them in the chat. And Jenni shared in the chat the Spring Flood AAR document. So to get all the details, please refer to it. Okay. Well, not seeing any comments or additional questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up our fall symposium for this 2024 year. Thank you all for attending, and really thank you for all our speakers who shared content and great information today. Really appreciate it. So again, this meeting was recorded, and so once the recording is complete and we were able to parse it out, we'll be sharing it with the field. So you can rewatch it, or your colleagues who missed it can have the opportunity to enjoy.